Hey, let me tell you a bedtime story. You don't need to think about tomorrow right now. Just breathe in and let the rain outside do the talking. The world can wait. Tonight is only for quiet and for rest. So close your eyes. Listen to the sound of the rain and let the story carry you somewhere soft, somewhere peaceful. The Billionaire's Secret Affair. Alexander Stone had everything a man could possibly want, or at least everything a man was supposed to want. He was 45, CEO of a global investment empire, photographed in navy suits that fit like they were stitched directly to his frame. The business magazines loved him. Self-made visionary, America's favorite family man. He had the wife, elegant, charitable, the perfect accessory at charity galas. He had the children, two photogenic teenagers, both tucked neatly into prep schools with ivy-covered walls. He had the house, a mansion outside New York, all glass and marble, the kind of home that made interior designers drool. To the public, Alexander Stone was a storybook. But stories always leave out the footnotes. The first whisper wasn't about his money. It wasn't about his company. It wasn't even about politics. It was about where he went when he wasn't where he was supposed to be. An aide once saw him slip into an elevator of a Manhattan tower where he owned no office. A driver once picked him up at midnight, not from his home, but from a hotel on the west side. A doorman remembered a cash tip that was too large for a simple favor: to forget who you saw. Rumors flickered, but they didn't spread, because Alexander Stone was not a man people gossiped about. He was a man people protected, obviously. Billionaires don't bend to rumor. Rumor bends to them. The truth was simpler and more dangerous. Behind the face on magazine covers lived a man addicted to secrecy. Alexander owned a condo under a false name, one of many, sparse, hidden, outfitted with blackout curtains and wine cabinets. He visited it often, never staying long, always leaving just enough trace for someone curious to ask questions. And he wasn't alone. There was her. She wasn't his wife. She wasn't his equal in money or power. She was the opposite. Younger, hungry, reckless enough to be dangerous. Their meetings were a collision of opposites, and Alexander reveled in it. Hotels, condos, hidden villas, private yachts where no cameras dared intrude. Gifts slipped into her hands. A necklace, a car, even whispered promises of more. This wasn't just an affair. It was an empire of its own, built on shadows. The trip that sealed the whispers came one summer. Alexander chartered his own yacht, a floating palace of white steel and champagne glass. Officially, it was a family vacation. Unofficially, it was a performance staged for two. They sailed to the Amalfi Coast. The paparazzi lenses couldn't pierce the horizon. Days were public, phone calls, staged photos. Nights were private, her laughter echoing across polished decks, champagne dripping like liquid gold. Crew members looked away. Of course they did. Who was going to question Alexander Stone? Their paychecks depended on his silence as much as his did on theirs. Alexander's indulgence wasn't confined to yachts and condos. There were circles, private, discreet, and powerful. The kind of societies whispered about at midnight dinners, clubs where masks weren't costume but necessity, where names went unspoken, and where pleasure was currency traded as easily as stock. He didn't flaunt it. He didn't need to. He belonged, and belonging meant protection. A senator once spotted him there and pretended not to. A CEO once brushed past him and later donated to his foundation. Suspicion wilted in the face of influence. There were people who knew, or thought they knew. Assistants, drivers, doormen. A couple of colleagues who saw too much. But Alexander Stone wasn't the kind of man you exposed. He was the kind of man you ignored. Because to expose him was to risk everything. So the whispers stayed whispers. The suspicions stayed silent. For now. But secrets are never stable. They don't sit quietly in the corner while you live your life. They grow, they demand, they sharpen into claws. For Alexander Stone, the secret would not stay locked in condos or yachts. It would grow into blackmail. It would crack his family man image. It would threaten his empire. And when it broke, it wouldn't just be a scandal. It would be a spectacle. Because nothing is more fascinating than watching a man who has everything lose it all. Obviously. The first time she saw the condo, she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. A place like this, glass walls, soft grey furniture, chandeliers that looked like constellations, hidden under someone else's name. No trace of Alexander Stone anywhere. This isn't yours, she teased, tracing a finger along the marble countertop. Everything's mine, he answered. And, in a way, it was true. The condo wasn't listed in his holdings. It was tucked beneath layers of shell corporations and trust funds, the kind of camouflage only billionaires could afford. It wasn't a home. It was a stage, a backdrop for stolen nights, for secrecy disguised as simplicity. Every detail was chosen with intention. Blackout curtains, a stocked bar, candles that masked every trace of perfume. A place designed not to exist. They met there often. Not every night, that would have been suspicious. But enough for her to begin associating the smell of oak floors and leather with him. Enough for him to feel the thrill of slipping away from his curated life into this other one. Of course, people noticed his absences. But they didn't question them. Billionaires don't need excuses. Their lives are built on being too busy. If the condo was a stage, the hotels were theatre. He never chose the obvious. Never the places where other billionaires paraded mistresses in plain sight. Instead, he picked discreet towers with coded elevators, suites with private entrances. He was meticulous. Meetings arranged like boardroom deals, scheduled, protected, rehearsed. But beneath the order was chaos. Every encounter was risk wrapped in silk. She was reckless in her own way, leaving a scarf behind once, smudging lipstick on a glass that a maid almost noticed. They laughed at their close calls, but the laughter carried nerves. It was dangerous, yes, but danger was the point. Of course, someone suspected. The concierge who always looked twice, the driver who wondered why Alexander asked for the back entrance. But suspicion has a price, and Alexander tipped too well for anyone to pay it. The sea was freedom. No eyes, no cameras, no questions. On his yacht, a sleek vessel that gleamed like a shard of white marble, Alexander lived without caution. Officially, it was for business retreats. Unofficially, it was for her. They sailed through the Mediterranean, through Caribbean waters, through bays where paparazzi lenses couldn't reach. The days were staged. Crew in pressed uniforms, champagne served, laughter echoing like any billionaire's holiday. Nights were quieter, shadowed, with only the hum of the sea and the crackle of candlelight. He bought her gifts during these voyages, diamonds that glimmered like salt in the sun, silk dresses flown in overnight from Paris, books bound in leather with her initials etched into the spine. She once asked why. Why risk everything? Why her? His answer was simple. Because you're the one thing money can't buy. Obviously, that wasn't true. Money had bought everything else. But truth mattered less than performance. And in those moments, on those decks, they believed the lie together. This act moves beyond private condos and yachts to something far darker. Alexander's secret society, the kind of elite club whispered about in rumors. Here, we'll lean into atmosphere, suggestion, and power. Masks, rituals, whispered rules. The story will balance luxury with danger and show how a couple of people begin to suspect the truth, but deliberately look the other way because of who Alexander is. The envelope was black. No return address, no stamp, no name. Just left on the desk of her condo one evening, as though it had materialized out of the air. Inside was a single card, Friday, midnight, where nothing familiar. She stared at it, confused, until Alexander explained. His tone was casual, almost bored, but his eyes gave him away. This wasn't dinner, this wasn't business. This was something older, stranger. Not everyone gets invited, he said. Most people spend their lives hearing rumors and nothing more. She almost asked why he was bringing her. Instead, she nodded. Obviously, billionaires don't wait in lines. They're escorted through doors the rest of the world doesn't know exist. The club was buried beneath Manhattan, disguised as nothing. An abandoned theater, its marquee long dark, hiding what thrived below. Inside, masks. Everyone wore them. Some Venetian, some sculpted, some plain. Identities weren't secret, not really. But the illusion of secrecy mattered. Power pulsed through the room. Politicians, CEOs, heirs, and actors. People whose names lit headlines by day gathered here by night, stripped of titles, draped in anonymity. It wasn't a place for love. It was a place for appetite, for testing the boundaries of control. Alexander walked as though he belonged, because he did. She followed, wide-eyed, half afraid and half thrilled. The club was velvet and shadows, chandeliers dimmed low, whispers carried like prayers. There was no menu, no schedule, no rules anyone admitted out loud, only the unspoken agreement. What happened here stayed here. Of course, some suspected. A senator's aide once followed him into the theater, only to be intercepted at the door and quietly paid off. But suspicions around Alexander never lasted. His money made sure of it. Weeks passed. The circle became their ritual. Condos and hotels were thrilling, yes. But the club was something else. It was dangerous, theatrical, intoxicating. Alexander began giving her gifts connected to the circle. A mask carved from onyx, a dress flown in overnight from Milan, jewelry that glittered like forbidden symbols. Each gift was both indulgence and reminder. You belong to this now. She began to notice things. The way people glanced at Alexander with recognition, even behind their masks. The way others gave him space, as though proximity was both privilege and risk. A colleague at his firm once remarked on Alexander's late nights, the odd absences, the unexplained trips. He must be working on something big, the man laughed. Alexander only smiled. Of course the colleague suspected. But who was going to question the billionaire who signed his checks? Suspicion was inconvenient. And in Alexander Stone's world, inconvenient things were ignored. It began with whispers. Alexander's board members noticed his absences. Important meetings rescheduled, calls missed, numbers once sharp, now blurred. He's distracted, one muttered. Family trouble, another guessed. But no one dared say more. Alexander Stone wasn't a man you confronted, not directly. Yet whispers have a way of travelling. Assistants noticed the same absences. Drivers asked quiet questions. Hotel concierges shared knowing looks. The billionaire's affair wasn't a secret anymore. It was an open question waiting for someone bold enough to answer, obviously. When a man builds his image too perfectly, the cracks shine brighter. Her name was Emily Vargas, young, ambitious, relentless. She wasn't supposed to be chasing Alexander Stone. She was covering financial scandals in New York when the first clue dropped into her lap. A receipt from a Manhattan condo leased under a false name. The payments routed through a Stone subsidiary. Emily didn't ignore coincidences. She traced the condo to late-night arrivals, to a woman seen slipping inside. No photographs yet, but enough to raise suspicion. The deeper she dug, the stranger it grew. Yacht logs that didn't match his public calendar. Jewelry purchases disguised as business expenses. Donations routed through shell accounts. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a story waiting to be told. Emily smelled blood, and Alexander Stone's empire smelled like a feast. It started with an email. No greeting, no signature, just a demand. $5 million. Wire transfer. Discretion or destruction attached were photographs. Grainy, yes, but damning. Alexander and his lover entering the condo, boarding the yacht, leaving the secret club. Enough to ruin his family man image forever. Alexander stared at the screen, jaw tight. Money wasn't the issue. He had money. What he didn't have was time. The scandal, once public, would bleed him dry. Not financially, but reputationally. He called his lawyers. He called his fixer. He called her. Stay quiet, he told her. Don't answer calls. Don't post. Don't exist. But silence couldn't fix what had already begun. Emily Vargas was still chasing the trail. The blackmailer wasn't bluffing. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Stone realized he wasn't the only one pulling the strings. Claire Stone had spent years perfecting the role of billionaire's wife. She attended galas, smiled for cameras, and spoke in carefully measured tones about charity and community. She wasn't naive. She knew powerful men strayed. But she believed Alexander was different. Until the absences grew too obvious. Until whispers reached her ears. Not from tabloids, but from friends too polished to gossip. She confronted him once. Just once. "You're distracted," she said, voice steady but sharp. "Is it the business, or is it something else?" Alexander gave the performance of his life. He smiled, kissed her hand, told her everything was fine. But Claire had lived beside him long enough to know when a lie left his lips. The perfect family image was cracking, and Claire was watching it crumble. For her, the affair had been intoxicating at first. The condos, the yachts, the gifts. But gifts are heavy when they come wrapped in secrecy. She noticed the blackmail first, the tension in his shoulders, the late-night calls he refused to explain, the paranoia that shadowed his once effortless confidence. "Are we worth it?" she asked him one night, in the hidden condo where their affair had begun. "More than worth it," he insisted. But his eyes betrayed fear. She began to wonder if she was a lover or an accomplice, if she was the prize, or simply the liability that might cost him everything. The secret society had rules, unspoken but ironclad. One of them was discretion. Another was loyalty. Alexander had enjoyed their protection for years, but whispers were dangerous, even here. At one midnight gathering, masked faces turned colder when he entered. Conversations hushed. Glances lingered longer than they should. A man he knew only as the chairman leaned close and warned him. Control your story, Alexander, or someone else will. For the first time, the society that had made him feel untouchable felt like a threat. Because if Alexander fell, he wouldn't fall alone. He would drag names, fortunes, and reputations with him. And the circle never forgave liabilities. The secret society had rules, unspoken but ironclad. One of them was discretion, another was loyalty. Alexander had enjoyed their protection for years, but whispers were dangerous, even here. At one midnight gathering, masked faces turned colder when he entered. Conversations hushed, glances lingered longer than they should. A man he knew only as the chairman leaned close and warned him. Control your story, Alexander, or someone else will. For the first time, the society that had made him feel untouchable felt like a threat. Because if Alexander fell, he wouldn't fall alone. He would drag names, fortunes, and reputations with him, and the circle never forgave liabilities. It didn't happen with a bang. It happened with a whisper, a headline buried halfway down a digital feed, barely noticed at first. Exclusive: billionaire Alexander Stone linked to secret Manhattan condo. Just a blog post, nothing special. No flashing banners, no screaming news anchors. Just quiet words, quietly spreading. At first, no one paid attention. But rumors, like seeds, have a way of finding light. They drift through timelines and whispers, through private chats and coffee shop murmurs. By the time anyone realized what was happening, the story had already taken root. A small paper picked it up, then a larger one. Within days, it was everywhere. Photographs surfaced, receipts, yacht logs, private jet manifests, enough evidence to smother every denial before it could even form. And with those photos came names, faces, locations, fragments of a life that was never meant to be seen. The story spread like wildfire, but not in flames, in clicks and shares, in the quiet hum of millions of screens lighting up in the dark. People didn't shout, they simply watched. And Alexander Stone, once untouchable, became a name whispered with curiosity, disbelief, and a little bit of glee. The same public that once celebrated him now devoured him. Talk shows mocked his fall from grace. Comedians turned his affair into easy punchlines. Memes, edits, threads, all clawing at his image until it was nothing but fragments. His company's stock began to fall. Investors fled like birds sensing a storm. Charity partners cut ties, politely but quickly. And politicians who once smiled beside him now deleted old photos and statements of support. Loyalty, he realized, was never loyalty at all. It was convenience. In his world, loyalty was rented, never owned. Behind every smile had been a transaction. Behind every friendship, a ledger. And now that the balance had shifted, all of it collapsed. The laughter, the invitations, the admiration. It wasn't anger the world felt for him. It was satisfaction. The quiet joy of watching someone who had everything lose everything. It's strange how people love to build up idols, but love even more to watch them fall. Claire didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even ask why. Her silence was colder than any fury. At charity events, she stood beside him, perfect posture, gentle smile. But she never looked at him. At home, she moved through rooms as though he didn't exist. The air between them was polite, but hollow. When she finally left, she didn't slam doors. She simply packed her things, signed the papers, and left behind an echo that never quite faded. The public sided with her. They always do. She became the symbol of grace in betrayal, the woman who kept her dignity, while the man who claimed to love her drowned in his own lies. Alexander tried to reach out. What could he say? Apologies felt small compared to the wreckage, and so he stopped trying. He let her go, not out of kindness, but because holding on would have been cruel. The headlines softened over time. Claire Stone, moving forward. She was photographed smiling again, speaking at foundations, holding her children's hands. She rebuilt herself quietly, beautifully. He watched from afar, and for the first time in his life, he understood what true strength looked like. It wasn't in wealth or power, it was in silence. She vanished, not into interviews, not into memoirs, not into scandal shows. She simply disappeared. No one knew where she went. Not her friends, not the photographers, not even him. The villa was empty. The phone numbers disconnected. The perfume she once wore still lingered faintly on the clothes he hadn't thrown away. Faint, fading, almost imaginary. Had she loved him? Or had she loved the idea of him? The man who could open any door, buy any dream? He would never know. And perhaps it was better that way. Sometimes the ghosts we never see again are the ones that haunt us the longest. He would think of her when the night felt too quiet, when rain touched the window, when a certain song played, when he poured his drink and saw two reflections instead of one. But eventually, even those memories blurred. She became less a person, more a story, a name without a voice. The chapter closed too soon, and deep down, he knew that was how she wanted it. The circle, that inner world of the powerful, the rich, the untouchable, closed its doors. The dinners stopped. The invitations vanished. People who once greeted him with warmth now looked away. One night he received a single envelope, black, sealed with wax. Inside, a card, blank except for 3 words. You broke it. He understood immediately. The circle thrived on secrets, on discretion, on silence. He had failed to protect that code, and so he was out. He had thought power meant safety. He had thought money could buy immunity. But power is a mirror. Once it cracks, no one wants to see the reflection in it. And so, the empire that took decades to build, boardrooms, estates, yachts, awards, dissolved not with destruction, but with distance. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were cancelled. Doors that once opened before he even knocked now stayed shut. He was no longer one of them. He was a reminder of what happens when someone forgets that even kings bleed. Months passed, then more months. The headlines faded. New scandals rose to take his place. The world moved on, as it always does. And in a smaller home, not a mansion, not a penthouse, just a quiet place with peeling paint and a view of the skyline, Alexander sat alone. He didn't miss the noise anymore. He didn't miss the cameras, or the speeches, or the applause. What he missed was silence, without regret. He would pour himself a glass of whiskey, sit by the window, and watch the city lights flicker. There was something comforting about them. Little sparks that didn't care who he used to be. He thought of everything he had gained and lost. The business empires, the headlines, the nights that blurred into each other, too loud, too bright. He thought of Claire, of the lover who vanished, of the friends who turned away. He thought of his younger self, ambitious, hungry, brilliant, and wondered if that boy would recognize the man sitting here now. And he whispered quietly to no one at all. Was it worth it? The answer came, soft and uneven. Yes, he said, because for a moment I felt alive. Then, after a pause, "No, because it cost me everything else." He smiled at the contradiction, because maybe that was the truth of all human stories, that sometimes we chase the things that destroy us, and we call it living. Outside, the rain began to fall, steady, gentle, like forgiveness. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to be anyone at all. Every empire falls, some to enemies, some to time. Alexander Stone's empire fell to temptation, not because he was evil, not because he was reckless, but because he was human, and humans always think they can balance desire and consequence. In the end, it wasn't the money that betrayed him. It wasn't the press. It wasn't even the lover. It was the illusion that he could live two lives without either one collapsing. The world would move on. New stories would rise. His name would become trivia, a lesson whispered in business schools and late-night conversations. How even the strongest can fall. But in some quiet corner of New York, under the hum of rain and the glow of distant towers, an older man sits alone, remembering the noise of the world that once belonged to him. He doesn't chase it anymore. He doesn't mourn it either. He just breathes. Because when the empire falls, what's left is the man beneath it. And the peace that comes with finally being small. And that is how the empire of Alexander Stone ended. Not in fury, not in fire, but in silence. A quiet ending for a loud life. And somewhere beyond the noise of the city, the rain keeps falling, steady and endless, washing away the dust of everything he used to be. After the noise faded, there came stillness. Long, unbroken, heavy stillness. Days blurred into each other. Mornings came with light that didn't feel warm. The city outside moved on, fast and indifferent, but Alexander moved through his house as though time had lost meaning. He learned small rituals again, making coffee without rushing, watering plants that didn't need him, but somehow survived anyway. Watching rain slide down glass and realizing it looked different now. Not dramatic, not poetic, just honest. He stopped checking the news. He stopped searching his name. The world no longer belonged to him. And strangely, that was a kind of peace he never expected to find. Sometimes he would walk late at night, hands in pockets, face hidden under the collar of an old coat. No one recognized him anymore. That anonymity, once unthinkable, became his favorite luxury. He began writing letters he never planned to send, some to Claire, some to the woman who vanished, some to himself. They were soft confessions, folded and tucked into drawers. He wrote about the boardrooms, the champagne, the illusion of control. He wrote about guilt that lingered like smoke. He wrote about love, or what he once thought love meant. The words came slow at first, then faster, as though his soul had been waiting years to exhale. In one letter he wrote, "Maybe we spend our lives building walls, not to keep others out, but to hide the emptiness inside." When the drawer finally filled with envelopes, he didn't read them again. He simply tied them with a ribbon and placed them in a box under his bed, a small archive of everything unsaid. One evening, while buying groceries, he met a stranger, a young man, polite, quiet, who recognized him but pretended not to. At the checkout line, the man simply said, "You were important once." Alexander smiled faintly. "Once," he repeated. The man nodded. "Still are, maybe not to the world, but someone's learning from your mistakes." They parted without names. But that moment stayed with him, the strange mercy of being remembered, not for glory, but for being human enough to fail. That night, Alexander wrote one more line in his notebook. Maybe purpose isn't about being admired. Maybe it's just about being honest before the end. Years passed quietly. Grey threaded through his hair, and the rhythm of solitude became second nature. One spring morning, Claire came to visit. She didn't call first. She simply appeared. The same grace, the same composure, but with softer eyes now, eyes that no longer carried anger. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. For a while, they said nothing. Then she asked gently, "Do you regret it?" He looked down at his hands, older, slower, but still shaking when memory stirred. "Yes," he said, "and no." She nodded. "I understand," she whispered. They spoke for hours, not about what happened, but about their children, about life, about peace. When she left, she touched his shoulder, light, forgiving. After she was gone, he realized he could finally breathe without the weight in his chest. Forgiveness, it seemed, was quieter than he imagined, almost invisible, but it changed everything. The years softened the sharp edges of his story. Time did what no apology ever could. It turned pain into memory. Alexander spent his last years in simplicity. Books, tea, morning walks. Sometimes he'd sit by the window and watch the skyline. The same city that once bowed before him, now distant, unreachable, but beautiful still. He never rebuilt the empire. He never wanted to. He understood finally that empires exist only to fall, that their purpose is to teach us what remains when the dust settles. And what remained was small, but real. The warmth of sunlight through curtains, the rustle of leaves, the hum of rain at night, the soft beating of a heart no longer chasing anything. When he passed, there were no headlines, just a quiet notice in the corner of a local paper. Alexander Stone, philanthropist and former CEO, has died at home. No scandal, no spectacle, just peace. Somewhere, rain was falling again, steady, rhythmic, unbothered by the world's noise. And if anyone had been listening closely enough, they might have heard it whisper his last lesson. Every empire falls. But if you're lucky, you learn to love the silence it leaves behind. When summer came, Alexander began to tend a garden. It started small, a few potted plants by the window, something to keep his hands busy. But slowly it grew. Rows of lavender, wild mint, and pale white roses that leaned toward the light as if searching for something gentle. Every morning, he'd step outside barefoot, feeling the cool grass between his toes, the scent of earth rising softly in the air. He found comfort in the rhythm of it, watering, trimming, listening. Plants didn't care about his past. They didn't ask questions. They only asked for patience. Sometimes he'd talk to them, not out loud, but in thought. He'd tell them about the noise of his old life, about boardrooms and yachts and the dull ache of being worshipped. And as he trimmed a rose stem, he realized everything he had chased before was like that flower, beautiful, fragile, temporary. When neighbors passed by, they'd see him there, the old man in the garden smiling quietly to himself. Some recognized him, some didn't. It didn't matter. Once, a little girl from next door asked, "Were you someone important?" Alexander smiled and said, "I used to think so. But now, I just grow things." The girl nodded like it made perfect sense. And maybe it did. Because in that small garden, surrounded by things that grew without greed or ambition, he finally found what all his money could never buy. a reason to wake up without pretending. He began writing again, but not letters this time. Small notes about what bloomed, what withered, what returned. It was a quiet reminder that life, no matter how broken, always finds a way to grow again. And as he sat there under the late afternoon sun, the world didn't feel like it had ended anymore. It simply felt smaller and softer and kinder. Years folded into each other until they no longer felt separate. Time became like water, moving, but without edges. Alexander grew older, slower, gentler. His hands trembled when he poured tea, but his eyes were still sharp, still watching the world with quiet awe. Sometimes he'd sit by the window at dusk, listening to the rain as it fell over the city he once ruled. He thought about all the names that had passed through his life, some that still made him smile, some that still ached like old scars. He remembered Claire's last visit, her hand on his shoulder, the soft forgiveness in her voice. He remembered the lovers' laughter, faint, fleeting, like music in another room. He remembered the long nights when he thought he could buy happiness, and the longer mornings when he woke up realizing he couldn't. But more than anything, he remembered silence. How silence used to frighten him, and how, in the end, became his most loyal companion. He kept one photograph on his desk, not of his empire, not of parties or awards, but of a single evening years ago, a sunset over the ocean, taken from the deck of a yacht he no longer owned. The light in the picture was golden, soft, forgiving. Underneath it, written in his handwriting, was one line: "Everything ends, but not everything is lost." One day, as the sky dimmed and the sound of rain deepened, Alexander sat in his chair by the window, a blanket over his knees, a cup of tea gone cold beside him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he wasn't the man who fell. He was simply a boy again, standing by the sea, dreaming of the world ahead. He breathed once more, slow and light, and smiled, not from joy, not from regret, but from peace. Outside, the rain continued its endless rhythm, falling over rooftops and empty streets, washing the city clean again. And when the morning came, the garden bloomed brighter than before, as if the earth itself had taken one last breath for him. The world would not remember the details of his fall, only the silence that followed. And maybe that was enough. Because some endings are not tragedies. They're just quiet truths. And in that quiet, the empire didn't die. It finally rested. Sometimes, when the night was quiet enough, the world between waking and sleep felt thinner, as if the soul could wander freely through the memories it once held dear. Alexander dreamed often in those final years, but they weren't the same dreams that had once haunted him. No boardrooms, no headlines, no flashes of cameras. Instead, he dreamed of oceans, of long roads stretching into sunlight, of laughter carried by the wind. In one dream, he found himself standing at the edge of a familiar garden. The roses were in bloom, pale, fragrant, swaying gently in a soft wind. Beyond them stood a small table, and at that table sat two figures, Claire, smiling faintly, and the woman who had once disappeared into the world. They weren't angry. They weren't sad. They were simply there, as though time itself had forgiven them all. Claire poured tea. The other woman reached out, touching a petal between her fingers. And Alexander stood there, watching the two fragments of his past finally share the same moment. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. In the dream, everything he had ever broken was whole again, not perfect, but peaceful. When he woke, dawn was spilling through the curtains. For the first time in years, he felt rested, not because the pain was gone, but because he had finally stopped trying to escape it. He sat up slowly, listened to the quiet hum of the world outside, and whispered to himself, "So this is what peace feels like." It wasn't loud, it wasn't grand, it was just still, and it was enough. The last storm of the season came on a Sunday. The clouds hung low, the sky dim and silver, and the garden shivered under the weight of the wind. Alexander sat by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass, slow, steady, endless. There was a journal on his lap, half filled with words no one would read. On the final page, he wrote a single sentence. "The world does not need to remember me. It only needs to keep growing." He smiled faintly at that. For a man who once measured his worth in headlines, it was a small miracle to end on such a quiet truth. The storm outside deepened. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and gentle, like an old friend's voice. And then, for a brief moment, everything went still. No sound, no motion, just the feeling of being suspended between breaths, as if the universe had paused to listen. He closed his eyes, and somewhere deep inside, the memories began to fade into light. The laughter, the mistakes, the love, the noise, all dissolving into something softer than silence. If someone had been there beside him, he might have heard a final whisper escape his lips, something that sounded almost like gratitude. And outside, the rain kept falling, not as mourning, but as renewal, each drop erasing what was old, making room for what might someday bloom again. When the storm passed, the sky opened into the calmest blue. The city below glimmered with reflections, and the garden swayed in the wind, alive, bright, forgiving. And though Alexander's stone was gone, the world remained, still imperfect, still beautiful, still moving forward. Because no empire truly ends. It simply changes hands. And every fall, every ending, is just the world beginning again. Years later, people said a quiet man once lived alone in a small house by the sea. No one really knew who he was, only that he kept to himself, and that he loved to sit by the shore as the sun went down. The neighbors would sometimes see him walking the beach at dusk, his shoes in his hands, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the horizon. They said he smiled often, but not in the way people do when they're happy. It was the smile of someone who had made peace with the ghosts that once haunted him. He had left no traces of the man he used to be. No gold, no headlines, no signs of power. Only a garden that grew wild and soft under the ocean breeze, and a window that faced the waves. Inside that house, there was an old piano. The keys were slightly yellow, the wood worn smooth from years of touch. Sometimes at night, the faint sound of music drifted across the shore. Slow, tender, almost broken, like a lullaby played for no one in particular. If you stood close enough, you could hear the melody carried by the wind. A simple tune, the kind that sounded like goodbye and forgiveness at the same time. And though few ever knew his name, those who passed by the house said something strange, that being near it always felt calm, as if the place itself remembered a man who had finally learned how to rest. When Alexander's story ended, there were no statues, no grand memorials, no speeches carved into marble. His name faded from the news, his company became someone else's, and the world kept spinning, indifferent, relentless, beautiful. But legacy isn't always measured in what's built or owned. Sometimes it lives quietly, in the lessons whispered to no one, in the mistakes that become warnings, in the peace found too late, yet still found all the same. Somewhere, a young man reads an old article about Alexander Stone. He closes his laptop, leans back, and sighs, thinking not about scandal, but about the fragility of ambition. Somewhere, a woman walks past the sea and hears faint piano notes through the wind. She pauses, listens, and smiles, without knowing why. And somewhere, perhaps in the spaces between rain and memory, the world keeps retelling the same old story of power, of loss, of redemption through silence. Every empire falls, yes, but from its ruins, flowers always grow. The garden by the sea keeps blooming, softly, endlessly. And maybe that is all the legacy any of us can hope for. To fall, to break, to fade, and somehow still leave behind a place where peace can grow.